The Chimera Ant arc is hard to talk about for a number of reasons. First of all, it is divisive. This is one of the most controversial arcs in all of anime, with many fans hailing it as an unparalleled masterpiece, while others say that it ruined the show for them and is nigh unwatchable. It's also a very long arc, accounting for almost half the runtime of the anime and including at least 4 distinct stages and give or take a dozen different overlapping storylines, depending how you count. It's also hard to talk about because when this arc hits like it's meant to, if you're able to get past the aspects that some people have a hard time with and fully appreciate it as it's meant to be experienced, it will alter your brain chemistry. This arc, for many people, is emotionally devastating to a degree that is hard to find in honestly any genre of narrative fiction, and it can be a sensitive subject for people who experience it in that way. However, despite all of that, in this video, I am going to talk about the Chimera Ant arc. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how it is, at its core, an anti-capitalist story. So to start out, let's do a very brief refresher if you haven't seen it in a minute, and spoilers warning if you haven't seen it at all. I'm going to really emphasize here, don't spoil this for yourself. Go watch it or read it and then come back. Okay, so the Chimera Ant arc at the highest level possible tells the story of a small group of hunters, including Gon and Killua and Chairman Netero and roughly half a dozen others, who are responding to a magical beast infestation on the southern islands of the European continent. To be clear, I'm not going to be giving a full recap of this whole arc. That would take a very long time, but what I am going to do is skim through most of it and highlight just the main story points that are necessary to contextualize the analysis that I want to give here. Early on, we see the queen eating animals from the sea and the cave she washes ashore in. We see the first generation of soldier ants descending on human villages. We see Kurt and Reyna being captured and eaten. We see Kite's team attempting to locate the queen. The first main thing we need to highlight is Kite's death. When Gon and Killua and Kite are first investigating, Kite realizes that he has underestimated how far along the infestation has gotten and how dangerous it's going to be. He kind of realizes this when he receives the note from Ponzu, which is why he makes Gon and Killua prove themselves to him by fighting Ramit early on, but what he still doesn't foresee is the Royal Guard, specifically P2. If you've seen it, you know what happens. P2 attacks them from impossibly far away and takes off Kite's arm. Kite tells Gon and Killua to run, but Gon is immediately enraged and loses his cool and is about to attack P2 and is only saved by Killua, who, realizing the severity of the situation, bonks him real good on the head and carries him all the way out of NGL as fast as he can. After they leave, Kite is killed, but Gon doesn't know that, and when he finally wakes up, he tells Killua that Kite is definitely alive and that they have to get back in there and save him, which is obviously setting up some future conflict. In the meantime, though, a lot of stuff happens. We meet Palm, Knuckle, Shoot, a bunch of the Chimera Ants. Netero, Nav, and Moral wage 4-dimensional guerrilla warfare as a light training exercise for the chairman. The next key thing that happens is that the king is born. So the way that Chimera Ant colonies work is that once the queen gives birth to the king, the royal guard switch their loyalty from the queen to the king, and the royal guard and the king all take off together to establish a new colony, which is what happens. The king and the royal guard move to the nearby country of East Gorteau and take over the palace of the dictator, whose name, if you weren't aware, fun fact, is an anagram for Kim Jong-il. Interesting detail. Maybe I'll have something to say about that again later. Keep watching to find out. Anyway, they take over this country and start working to convert as many people as possible to be Nen users, both as potential soldiers for the king, but also maybe just as tasty snacks, because humans who can use Nen taste delicious to ants, apparently. This plan will also kill everyone else in the process, which will probably be like 99% of everyone in the country, millions of people, bad news. Also during this time, the king takes up an interest in games. To pass the time, and also to hone his mind, the king has the royal guards deliver him national champions at different strategy games so he can play against them. He masters chess and Go very quickly, showing us that not only is he like unbelievably powerful, he's also super smart, genius level strategist. He's basically just speed running, solving these games until eventually he's introduced to a fictional game, Gungi, and another one of the core characters from the story, Komugi, who is basically like the best Gungi player to ever live. Gungi, it turns out, is much more complex than chess or Go, and Komugi is way smarter at it than the king, and because of this, the king is forced to acknowledge her and to respect her, which is not something he's had to do with anyone else thus far. He listens to her and learns about her, he asks her name, and when she asks his in return, he realizes that he doesn't have one, and this bothers him. He wants a name. This all makes Poof deeply worried that the king is losing his true alpha nature, basically. The king wavers back and forth, telling the royal guard in one panel that Komugi has shown him that there are different kinds of strength, but ultimately deciding in the next that violence is the ultimate force in the world because it is capable of destroying all other kinds of strength. He heads to Komugi's room determined to kill her, asking himself what's holding him back, but when he arrives, he finds Komugi being attacked by a wild bird that somehow got into her room, and he acts on instinct to protect her and is deeply distressed by the fact that she's been injured. He's forced to recognize that what's holding him back is the fact that he cares for Komugi. She is his first and only friend, and despite what he just told his guards and himself, his capacity for violence is meaningless in the face of that human connection. Right after this, the invasion begins with Netero and Zeno dive bombing into the palace, and the rest of the hunters and a couple Chimera ant allies entering the palace through one of Nav's portals. Zeno's dragon dive bombards the whole palace with Nen arrows. P2 gets expeditiously swatted out of the sky by Netero, but they recover quickly and use their N to find the king. The king is still with Komugi, and Komugi has been hit by one of Zeno's Nen arrows. P2 arrives at basically the same time as Netero and Zeno, who immediately realize that this is not what they had signed up for. They thought they were on their way to extinguish an infestation of dangerous magical beasts, and what they find instead is, quote, a moment full of love towards one human life. The king tells P2 to heal Komugi, and he tells Netero and Zeno to go with him to a new location to fight. As they are leaving, Netero sees Gon looking for P2 and points him inside. Gon enters the tower and finds P2 treating Komugi and doesn't take it well, but agrees to allow them to continue healing Komugi for 1 hour, after which they will go with him to heal Kite. A lot more stuff happens. Again, there are so many plot threads and characters I'm not even touching on here. Shoot and Knuckle and Malorion and Yuppie and Ikalgo and Palm and Killua and Moral and Welfin. For our purposes, though, the next thing we need to talk about is the fight between Netero and the king. This is perhaps the most thematically dense and morally complex part of the whole arc. At the start of the fight, the king does not want to fight. He tells Netero that it is unnecessary. He has come to see that some humans have value, and he no longer wants to treat all of them as merely cattle. Netero thinks to himself that the king is fluctuating between ant and human, but he also knows that he needs to complete his mission. He convinces the king to fight by telling him that he knows his name and will only tell him if they fight. Netero seems to be getting the better of the fight for most of it, but the king keeps taking hit after hit and bouncing back basically unscathed until eventually he breaks through Netero's rhythm and takes off his leg and then his arm. It seems the king has won, but Netero has a final card up his sleeve, which is a tactical nuke sewn inside of him and rigged to go off as soon as his heart stops. He tells Meruem his name as he stabs his own heart, and Meruem takes the nuke at effectively point blank range. At roughly the same time, P2 has finished healing Komugi, and Gon tells them that time is up. They go to the castle where Kite is being kept, and P2 finally reveals to Gon what everyone else has already basically known, that Kite is already dead and cannot be brought back. This causes Gon to turn into a 30-year-old man, and he proceeds to demolish P2. Like, it's not even close. He does this by making a Nen contract, sacrificing his life in order to access, quote, all the power I'll ever have, right now, then and there. He's repeatedly smashing P2's head in when Killua shows up and is horrified to see how Gon has transformed himself. He watches as P2's lifeless body is puppeted by their residual Terpsichore Nen and takes Gon's arm off. Gon says that he's happy because now he's like Kite was, and then he stabs P2 into the ground with his own severed arm. Now, if you've seen it, then you know the final thing we need to recap. Meruem survives the nuke, at least temporarily. He's nursed back to life by Poof and Yuppie, and then they all head back to the palace. He's lost his memory, but he knows he's forgetting something important. Something critically important, really the only thing he cares about anymore, but he can't remember what it is. Poof knows that it's Komugi, but he doesn't want Meruem to remember. He does everything he can to keep him from remembering, but eventually it all falls through. Meruem finds Welfin, and Welfin manages to summon all of his willpower to find the one thing that will save his life, and he says Komugi's name. Meruem remembers that the only thing in the whole world that really matters to him is Komugi. He finds Palm and tells her that he is dying from radiation poisoning, and that all he wants is to spend his remaining hours with the only person he's ever had a genuine human connection with, the only person he's ever loved. Palm tells him where to find Komugi, and he does. He tells Komugi that he is dying and that the disease will spread to her if they stay together. She says she doesn't care, and you know how it ends after that. So, for just a minute, I want to address the controversy surrounding this arc. As I said earlier, some people think that this arc might be one of the best stories ever told in, like, all of fiction, period, while others feel quite the opposite. Now, as you may have guessed, I very much fall into the first camp. However, I can understand some of the things that people struggle with in this arc, especially early on in the animated version. For one, the pacing at the beginning can feel a bit slow. There's a lot of exposition happening all at once, and coming off the Greed Island arc, which ends with like one single very high stakes dodgeball match, I get how switching it up and introducing the Queen and Kurt and Reina and Pokol and Ponzu and NGL and a stick dinner, basically all at the same time, can kind of feel like a slog. I also understand how some people have a hard time with the way that the early Chimera ants especially were animated, mostly feeling like they kind of look goofy as hell, and you know, they're not entirely wrong. In the manga, the art and tone is clearly meant to be horror, but that really just doesn't come through the same way in the anime. My main theory, though, on what makes this arc land for some people and not for others is just that you get out of it what you put into it. This is a high engagement story. It expects you to take it seriously and be fully paying attention, and also to like let it cook for a bit while it gets to where it's going. And if you're not able to do that for whatever reason, you're simply not going to get the payoff that others do out of it later on. And ultimately that's fine. Different people have different tastes, but if you want to understand what those of us who do love it are talking about, maybe give it another watch and try to, as best as you're able, engage with it on its own terms, if that makes sense. Or read it. Great read, would recommend. Okay, rant over, let's talk about the themes. So the most common analysis that comes up when people talk about this arc are the inverse parallels of Gon and Meruem. People like to say that Gon starts the arc out as human and ends it as a monster, while Meruem starts the arc out as a monster and becomes progressively more and more human. And I think that this is an interesting and thought-provoking analysis that touches on some very real dynamics and core themes in the story, but I also don't think it's quite right. Mostly because I don't think Gon ever stops being portrayed as human. In fact, I think the reason his transformation and sacrifice is so moving is precisely because of how agonizingly human it is. He's experiencing profound grief and rage, and both of those are deeply human emotions. I think the more accurate way to phrase this common analysis would be to say that Meruem's story is about the way that mindless, violent domination is incompatible with one's humanity, and Gon's story is about what happens when the unbridled optimism and resiliency of the human spirit is forced to confront mindless violence and domination. This might seem like a nitpick, but I think it really matters because the core theme of the arc is not a vague idea of monstrosity in the abstract, but rather this specific tension between humanity and domination. This is most obvious in Meruem's story. Even before he is born, we hear about how strong he is going to be, how he will stand at the pinnacle of all species, according to the queen. And as soon as he's born, he very clearly demonstrates that he has no regard whatsoever for the value of other living things, whether that be his fellow ants or humans. They are all to him expendable and ultimately meaningless compared to his slightest whim. He kills random humans he sees on his way from NGL to East Gorteau. He attempts to kill Pitu when he takes the slightest offense to something they say. The other Chimera ants remark that he probably thinks of all other creatures as food, and when he arrives at the East Gorteau Palace, he quickly arranges to set up a, quote, meat orchard for processing humans as food. His whole existence is focused on the domination of other living beings based solely on his ability to do so. Domination for domination's sake, and he remains this way until he meets Komugi. Komugi is the most important character in this story. I think a more cynical analysis might complain that she's not actually that much of a character in her own right, that her role in the story is entirely tied to Meruem, and in terms of the plot itself, that is largely true, but I think that view misses the immense depth of Komugi's character, which is necessary for her to play the role in the story that she does. The pivotal change in Meruem doesn't take place merely because Komugi is able to crush him at Gungi. No, it happens because he's forced to confront her as a complex and fully autonomous individual with her own story and intentions. She tells Meruem how she was born into a large, poor family and became a Gungi master to provide for them. She tells him how she is clumsy and allegedly simple-minded, and Gungi is the only thing she can do well, which is why she stakes her life on it. At one point, Meruem asks her to make a wager on their next game, suggesting that if she wins, he will grant her any request she makes, but that if he wins, he will take her left arm as payment. She replies that those stakes are too low for her. Normally, she bets her life on games, since she knows that if she can't win at Gungi, she won't be able to provide for her family, and she will be, as she sees it, simply a burden. There's a lot to unpack there, but in response, the king tears off his own arm as an apology for insulting her and orders her to start the game. She realizes that he has been wounded and refuses to start playing until he receives medical treatment. When Meruem threatens her life if she doesn't start playing, she still refuses, and he is forced to give in and receive treatment. It's the first time he's encountered someone who he can't intimidate or kill because of her conviction and the fact that he cares about her, admittedly in a complicated way at first. This relationship is the crux of the whole story, and it only works because Komugi is given as much agency as anyone in the story, if not more than most. There are a number of characters who face down death in this story, but only two who do it without batting an eye, and Komugi is one of them. She changes Meruem from someone who only respects power in a violent, domineering sense to someone who understands that other people are really what matter in this life, and who by the end, in some way, understands love. If this change doesn't happen, the invasion plan ends with everyone dying. The fight between Netero and Meruem happens in the palace, not out in the desert, and when Netero's heart inevitably stops after a few minutes at most, everyone in the palace is killed by the poor man's rose. But this isn't what happens because of Komugi and the change that she brings about in Meruem. His progression from having no regard for the value of humanity or human connection at all to, at the end, it being the only thing he cares about. Now, Gon's arc is more complicated. Prior to the Chimera Ant arc, Gon is basically the prototypical shonen protagonist, to the point of honestly being a bit uninteresting as a character at times. I don't mean to say he's a bad MC, but he is so one note, positive, happy, determined, basically all the time, that prior to the Chimera Ant arc, I think most people would agree that Killua or Kurapika are both far more interesting characters. This is what sets up Gon's story in the Chimera Ant arc to be as devastating as it is. Togashi takes his perfect MC, this shining example of the indomitable spirit of humanity, and he shows us what happens when that character is confronted with the horror of death. the horror of someone he cares about being killed for no reason at all. I understand that the choice to literally age Gon like Togashi does is hard for some people to take seriously. Like, it's just too absurd. He looks too goofy in his crop top and tiny shorts, and what I would say is that A, Togashi is not a coward. He's not going to shy away from making bizarre choices when it's the right choice for the story, and B, this choice in particular is obviously hugely intentional and deeply intertwined with the themes of the story, symbolizing in a very literal way the loss of Gon's childlike innocence, the way that the violence of the world has mangled his spirit, literally causing him to appear as an adult. To say that Gon is simply a monster at the end is to ignore the fact that as he's at his absolute lowest, having sacrificed everything, his final thought is of the person he cared about who he lost, even causing him to turn his back on the person he cares about that is still right there with him. To grieve is to be human, and that's exactly what Gon is right up to the end of the arc. Now, the reality is that Togashi doesn't draw a clear line between being monstrous and being human. While he definitely portrays being violent and domineering as bad, he also goes out of his way throughout the arc to show us that these are things that humanity is capable of. The environmental devastation faced by Bono Lenov's tribe, the terrible labor conditions and poverty in the town Gyro grew up in, not to mention the utter neglect and abuse of his father, the horrible suffering of nuclear weapons. In the manga, before he introduces the twist that the rose is radioactive, there's this series of 4 pages of panels with no text, just illustrations depicting the horrors of humanity. Bombs, war, police brutality, hunger, abject poverty right alongside obscene wealth. And the message is clear. This story isn't just about the fantasy world of Hunter x Hunter. Subverting expectations in a genre as predictable as shonen is challenging. If a character wins a fight that we weren't expecting them to, we might be surprised the first time we see it, but on some level we knew it was a possibility, right? That possibility is what created the tension in the story in the first place. To truly subvert expectations on a deeper level, we need to be confronted with something that we didn't even know was a possibility within the scope of the genre itself. And the Chimera Antarc does this in 2 main places, in my opinion. Firstly, and to a slightly lesser extent, Gon's transformation. While it is not uncommon for MCs to go through some kind of dangerous transformation when they're pushed to their limits, it is very uncommon for that transformation to actually have real, severe, and lasting consequences like it does here. Gon may not actually have died, but at the point Togashi has written to in the manga, he still does not have his Nen back, and has effectively, it seems, been retired as the MC of the story in favor of Kurapika. The bigger and more important subversion that happens, though, is the rose. A shonen fight is supposed to be about which character is stronger, or who has the better strategy, and the fight between Netero and Meruem seems like it's going to give that to us until the very end, when it's snatched away. After Meruem survives the Zero Hand, what Togashi tells us is that Meruem might be stronger than Netero, but what's more deadly than either of them is nuclear weapons, a real thing that really exists in the real world. And not only that, he makes it explicit that even though Meruem was barely able to survive the bomb itself, he cannot survive the slower and more painful death by radiation poisoning. I know that some people find this subversion unsatisfying. If Meruem is as strong as he was built up to be, then shouldn't he be able to survive something as mundane as radiation poisoning? And, no. Why would he be able to do that? I get that most shonen have a tendency to hand wave these kinds of things away when they're inconvenient for the next big fight, but this isn't most shonen. There are real stakes here. We're shown that Meruem is incredibly powerful physically and mentally, but not that he has a resistance to radiation on a cellular level. Like, there would need to be some kind of explanation there, and Togashi doesn't give us one, because thematically, it's way more compelling to have the the impossibly powerful big bad for the whole arc die from something that real people in the real world have died from as a result of some of the worst atrocities ever committed by the human race. This is the biggest plot detail that tells us that this whole story is meant as a commentary on how these themes of violence and domination exist alongside and in opposition to humanity in the real world. So I think there are two ways to analyze the themes here. There's the way that I think Togashi probably meant them himself, and then there's the way that I think is a bit more specific and useful for the world today. I think most likely Togashi wrote this story from an anarchist perspective. I don't know if he would call himself an anarchist. I've looked into it, and as far as I've been able to find, he hasn't ever said anything to that effect, but all the signs are there. Anarchism is a philosophy which is based in, to quote Food Not Bombs founder Keith McHenry, the rejection of coercion and dominance in all forms. This is obviously central to the whole story. Firstly, there's the focus on individualism and personal identity and autonomy introduced from the very earliest stages of the arc. One of the few explicit statements Togashi gives us about the nature of humanity comes after the first soldiers with human traits have been born, and they ask the queen for permission to give themselves names. The queen has this bit of inner dialogue about the ants with human traits. She says, "Curious creatures. They're assertive and desire to be distinct. They place a high value on individualism, yet strive with one another for the good of the colony." Extremely anarchist coded, right? Balancing personal liberties with mutual aid and cooperation. Of course, not all the ants actually do end up cooperating with one another for the good of the colony, but I think we can take this as an aspirational statement at the least. He's also very obviously critical of governments generally, portraying every single nation we see in the arc as corrupt or oppressive in some way. He seemingly bases East Gorteau itself off a combination of North Korea and China, naming the leader after Kim Jong-il and naming the capital city Beijing, showing that he isn't merely critical of capitalist or imperialist states, but seemingly all states, regardless of whether they are capitalist or not, or where they exist in relation to global capital hegemony. Now, I think the most likely interpretation here is just that he genuinely believes, as many anarchists do, that these states are just as oppressive and tyrannical as Western media makes them out to be, without properly contextualizing or unpacking just how much what we hear about these countries in the West is either selectively told or sometimes just straight up fabricated as part of a long-running and very intentional effort to manufacture consent for the actions of the US military around the world. Feel free to rehash that Christian Divine v. Madeline Pendleton TikTok beef in my comments if you want. Give me that engagement, whatever, but to be clear, I will not be fighting people about it. That's not the point of this vid. Either way, what this really ultimately shows us is that Togashi is not specifically critiquing capitalist oppression, but rather all forms of oppression or domination, real or hypothetical, which again is pure anarchist philosophy. We also have the final direct statement he makes about the nature of humanity, which comes at basically the very end of the arc. Togashi shows us that the actual original leader of East Gorteau had retired long ago and is living a peaceful life in the countryside. He reads this quote from a fictional poem written by Togashi himself, quote, "Let us drink to this creature called man. Good and evil repeat in an endless cycle on the spiral of time, where a lifetime is far too long for peace, yet far too short for war. This is why they yearn. This is why they foster. If only they knew that all one needs in life is the sun, the soil, and poetry." And I think this is also very anarchist coded, not necessarily in the best way, maybe, but I do think it kind of shows a side of anarchism, which is not one of its better sides, where people sometimes kind of lose the plot a bit and veer away from what I would consider actual anarchism into isolationism and nihilism. In my view, the reason this happens to some anarchists is that if you base your philosophy solely around rejecting dominance and coercion, which are inherent to capitalism and imperialism, which make up the prevailing global order today, but then you also don't really have a plan to do anything about that besides just resisting in perpetuity, which I'm not saying is the case for all anarchists, but it is for a lot of them, what that can sometimes lead to is this kind of sentiment that's loosely expressed in this poem, that good and evil repeat in an endless cycle, i.e. things can't really be changed, and therefore all you should care about is the simple things in life. This is the kind of thinking that leads anarchists to go off the grid homesteading instead of actually staying plugged in to meaningful efforts to build class power and actually change things. And to be clear, that is an uncharitable read of the sentiment expressed in this poem, and as it's meant to be taken in the context of the whole story, I think it's pretty clearly meant to say that the pursuit of power for power's sake is not worthwhile, and instead we should care about living a good life with simple human concerns. This is a fine sentiment, and it fits perfectly at the end of this arc. What I think we can take from all this is that, at the very least, Togashi is anti-state, anti-dominance, pro-individualism, and pro-humanity. In the context of this story, those themes are extremely compelling and moving, and I think that's true of anarchism as well, right? I think a big part of why anarchism is so attractive, and I think something that Marxists often forget, is that it is still in the mainstream an extremely subversive philosophy with a lot of truth to it. Capitalism tells us that society should not and cannot be organized around real material human concerns, but that instead everything must be transactional. The pursuit of power for power's sake is both necessary and good for society, and it's something that we should all strive for, even at the expense of our own humanity and the well-being of others. Anarchism and the Chimera Ant arc both tell us very clearly that that's bullshit, that we should care about humanity above and beyond anything else, and that the mindless pursuit of power should be resisted at every turn. Those are good ideals that we should try to hold to at all times, but we also at some point might have follow-up questions like, why is capitalist society that way? How does it function, and how can we change it? And that's simultaneously where we move away from anarchism a bit, and also where the more interesting analysis of this arc comes into play, which is if we view it as a critique of not just violence or domination in a generalized sense, but more specifically as a critique of the MCM cycle and the profit motive under capitalism as described by Marx. Now, to be clear, I don't think this is something Togashi himself intended to put into the arc, nor do I think there's really a whole lot in the arc that explicitly evokes this analysis, but I also really don't think it's much of a stretch, because again, all we have to do is ask, how does this conflict between humanity and domination play out in the world today? Fair warning, this next bit might get just a little bit dense, but I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible, and we will tie it back to Hunter x Hunter, I promise. Just bear with me. So, in Das Kapital, Marx describes two cycles between money and commodities to explain how capital functions: the CMC cycle and the MCM cycle. The CMC cycle is the one that most normal people are familiar with on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis. In this cycle, people start out with commodities, usually their labor, and they trade this commodity for money, a wage. And then at the end of the cycle, they trade that money for other commodities, which they need or want, like food, housing, clothing, leisure time, whatever it is. In this cycle, the important thing is that the driving force is real human concerns. To quote Marx about the CMC cycle, consumption, the satisfaction of needs, in short, use value, is therefore its final goal. Most people go to their jobs and trade their labor for a wage because they are forced to in order to satisfy human needs, to care for themselves and their families. This is the driving force behind most people's participation in the economy under capitalism, but it is not the driving force behind society itself. Capitalism at its core does not care about human needs. What it cares about is generating profit for capitalists. And the way that this happens is the other cycle, the MCM cycle. The MCM cycle is the inverse of the CMC cycle, and while it's not something that most people consciously participate in, it is the driving force behind a capitalist economy. In this cycle, capitalists start out with money as capital. They then trade that money for commodities, which they then sell for more money than they bought for, generating profit. Now, you might ask, how does this increase in money happen? If the capitalist buys commodities at their fair exchange value and then sells commodities at fair exchange value at the end, where is the extra money coming from? And while there are a number of ways that commodities can increase in value circumstantially, the main driving way that this happens is labor. Labor as a commodity is unique from other commodities in that it has the ability to create new value as it, quote, acts on external nature and changes it. The ingredients for this production of value are 1, the materials being acted upon, 2, the tools used by the worker, and 3, the labor performed by the worker. For a simple example, let's say we have fabric and sewing machines. Without labor, these initial elements sit inert. They have a value of their own, of course, but it's not more than they were initially purchased for. It's only through the introduction of labor that we get clothing, a new commodity that is worth more than the materials we started with. And this is where the capitalist makes their profit, by exploiting the labor of the workers and paying them a wage that is less than the value they create. Now, today, there are far more complex ways that capitalists leech off society and generate profit for themselves. For example, credit systems and the finance industry have absolutely exploded since Marx's time, and automation has become far more advanced than he ever could have imagined. But all of that aside, the core of this formula remains relevant today, as it is still the driving logic behind capitalism and, at a global scale, imperialism. To put it simply, capitalists don't do things for the sake of addressing actual human needs in society. They do things for the sake of generating profit, which is an inherently exploitative and domineering goal. To quote Marx from Capital again, use values must therefore never be treated as the immediate aim of the capitalist. His aim is rather the unceasing movement of profit making. I think it's important to clarify here that this is not simply an indictment of behavior which can occur under capitalism. This cycle is inherent to capitalism. This is how capitalists maintain their power in society. Without this exploitation, capitalists would have no choice but to become workers themselves and actually contribute, and they don't want to do that. The leeching off the top, turning money into more money while ignoring human needs, is the core MO of capitalism as a system, and it's also effectively the core tension at the heart of the Chimera Antarch. This is the logic that stands in the way of actually addressing real societal needs and concerns in capitalist societies. This is why we can't just house people to end homelessness, train more medical professionals to address healthcare shortages, feed people to end hunger, or transition away from fossil fuels to address the climate crisis. To paraphrase Michael Parenti, there is no great secret to building housing or health clinics or food distribution centers or convenient and frequent public transportation. These are all things that have been done all around the world for decades and decades, and in some cases, since the dawn of history. The reason we don't do these things and address the material problems that so many in the world suffer from today is that capitalists stand in the way. They are, unfortunately, at the moment, the ruling class in society who get to make decisions about these kinds of things, and they plain and simple do not care about real human concerns. They care about profit. They care about protecting their class interests. They care about domination. This is how we can have economists telling us that the economy at large is doing great, while the reality for most people is that everything is getting more expensive, while wages are stagnating, evictions and homelessness are skyrocketing, and healthcare has never been harder to access. It's because for the capitalist ruling class, the economy is doing great. The things that are causing suffering for everyone else are precisely the levers they're pushing to generate more profit for themselves. This is what the mindless drive for domination looks like in our world today, and it is obviously inherently at odds with humanity. This is what I personally can't help but think about when I watch the Chimera Antarch. And I know I said earlier that it doesn't really explicitly evoke this analysis, but I do think it comes close at times when we hear Komugi tell us that she only thinks she has value as a person insofar as she's able to provide for her family. When Gyro is told that his dad only keeps him around to profit off his labor, when we hear how Bizef uses his power and influence to buy sex slaves for himself, when Meruem critiques humanity, noting that to the right of a border, children starve to death, to the left, the idle dregs of mankind feast on excess. There are many of these kinds of references to things we see in the real world today, which are at the root of it driven by capitalism. I think for so many of us, when we're first being radicalized against capitalism, realizing the deep inhumanity of the way that society is currently structured, it feels like going through Gon's arc and Meruem's arc simultaneously. Growing up in the imperial core, we're fed so many lies about how things have to be, about why people are forced to sleep outside right next to vacant apartments, about why we can't really do anything about the climate crisis even though we all know the stakes, about why we have to drop bombs on those kids overseas, and about how we should all just go along with it. Buy the car, buy the house, take the shitty job in an industry that's probably bad for society as a whole, but hey, it's one of the only ones that still pays well. Despite all that though, I think most of us manage to keep our humanity deep down somewhere. We might sip the Kool-Aid for a while, but we're not drunk on it. We know deep down that things aren't supposed to be this way, and the dissonance exists in us until we finally encounter something that causes a rupture. We watch that video of the cops an innocent child. We see our friends get overworked and underpaid for years with nothing to show for it. We watch our hard-earned tax dollars being used to kill innocent children while war profiteers rake in billions of dollars. We get diagnosed with a chronic illness. At some point, we decide enough is enough, and we start finding other people who feel the same. We take the dissonance and the outrage and put it into action, working for change, and we simultaneously feel the immense relief that comes from learning that the world doesn't actually have to be this way, and the overwhelming rage that it is this way nonetheless. The relief that there are so many other people who care about humanity and who want to work for a better world together, and the rage that so many people are suffering and dying just so that people in boardrooms can keep watching the line go up. At the end of the arc, there's this scene where Bloster, the lobster Chimera ant who was spared by Icalgo earlier in the arc, escorts Reyna back to her village. Earlier, he had told Welfin that he can't remember his human memories, but he can tell that Reyna does, even though she doesn't talk much. After Reyna has been reunited with her mom, the village wants to thank Bloster for bringing her back, and they encourage him to stay for dinner. He refuses, saying that he's, quote, not that kind of guy, and thinking to himself that he's now paid Icalgo back for sparing his life earlier, basically thinking of the whole thing as some kind of transaction. As he's leaving, Reyna goes after him and grabs his claw and insists, "Thank you. Let's eat. Come eat with us." Bloster starts crying, and I think the implication is pretty clearly supposed to be that despite what he said to Welfin earlier, despite the fact that he can't remember his past life, all it takes to be human is to help one another and share a meal together. And there is no room for the profit motive in that view of humanity. You don't help people and share in community to get a leg up on them, to turn money into more money, to grow your own power and influence. You do it because that's what it means to be a part of humanity. And I think what we have here is a kind of common baseline ethos and aspiration for both anarchism and Marxism, as well as the Chimera ant arc. An aspiration that is directly and fundamentally opposed to the logic of capitalism. Ultimately, there are many compelling ways to view this story, and that's a big part of what makes it so good. It's not too heavy-handed. It doesn't often tell us how we're supposed to feel about things. Instead, it makes us feel those things through the strength of the storytelling, and because of that, we do get to project our own meaning onto it to a degree. And personally, well, I think the analysis I've presented here is a compelling one, and one I keep coming back to. It's certainly not the only one. On that note, let me know your favorite takeaways from this arc in the comments below, if there's any big ones you think I missed, and I think that's actually all I have to say about it for now. This has been kind of a long one, so if you've stuck with me to the end here, thanks so much for watching, and if you want to help me decide what I should do for my next video, then go subscribe on my Patreon and I'll let y'all vote. Currently, I'm deciding between why My Hero Academia is imperialist propaganda or why car culture is inherently fascist. Go let me know what you want to see. I'll see y'all next time.
小麦いるか 聞いてますとも。